Taxi driver stunned upon discovering the passenger's destination is his own wife's house. Kevin had always been recognized as a calm, hard-working and dedicated man with an admirable patience for facing the daily challenges that his profession as a taxi driver for years presented him. Living a simple life in a modest house on the outskirts of the city, Kevin enjoyed the tranquility of his routine, although he knew that his reality was far from perfect. Married to Betty, a renowned professor at a respected university, their marital relationship followed a format that many would find peculiar. They lived in separate houses. This decision, made for practical reasons, initially seemed like a logical solution to avoid the long commutes that made Betty's routine difficult, since her university was very far from the house where Kevin lived. Thus, Betty had rented a place closer to the campus, something both agreed would be best to maintain a balance between their careers and their relationship. However, over the months, what seemed like a mere logistical adjustment began to create invisible but deep tensions. Betty's visits to Kevin's house became increasingly sporadic, and the conversations between them, once light and full of camaraderie, began to be marked by a cold and distant tone, as if the closeness they once shared was slowly wearing away. Kevin, though silent in his pain, began to notice the emergence of an unsettling emptiness, a sense of loss that he could not fully name, but that followed him more and more on his solitary days and long journeys behind the wheel. Kevin woke up to the persistent sound of the alarm clock like any other day. The sky was already clear, and he barely had time to reflect on the loneliness that inhabited his house before getting out of bed. He took a quick shower, made a coffee that he drank always in a rush, and left to start his shift. The taxi was parked in front of the house, waiting for him like an old companion of routine. After quickly checking the tires and the engine, Kevin started the car and drove through the still, quiet streets of that morning. He enjoyed the first rides of the day when the traffic was light and his mind could wander, distracted by the urban landscape. The first rides were ordinary, with rushed passengers and trivial conversations. A young man heading to work, a woman carrying shopping bags, a couple debating their destination. Kevin navigated the streets like he had for years, knowing every curve and every signal. Around 10 o'clock, while waiting at a strategic spot, he saw a man waving to hail the taxi. Kevin pulled over, opened the window, and greeted the passenger with his usual cordiality. "Good morning, sir," Kevin said, adjusting the rearview mirror as the man entered. "Good morning," the man replied in a light tone. "I need to go to 45 Wolf Street." For a moment, Kevin felt his heart tighten, but managed to disguise it. He knew that address. It was the house Betty had rented. Disguising his nervousness, he confirmed the destination with a nod. "All right, sir. We'll be there in about 20 minutes, Kevin said, adjusting the steering wheel. He cast a discreet glance at the rearview mirror, observing the passenger. The man seemed relaxed, fiddling with his phone with a calm smile. Trying to dissipate the growing tension, Kevin initiated a conversation, as he usually did. "Wolf Street is a quiet area. Do you often go there?" Kevin asked, keeping his eyes on the road. "Actually, not that often," the man replied, putting his phone in his pocket. "Today is a special day. I'm going to visit someone." Kevin tried not to react, but his mind was already on alert. "I see," he said casually. "Family or friends?" "Neither," the passenger said, laughing softly. "It's someone special. I guess you could say we're getting to know each other better." The tension in Kevin grew with each word, but he kept the conversation going, struggling to maintain control. "It's always good to meet new people," Kevin commented, glancing once more at the rearview mirror. "That's true," the man said with a gleam in his eyes. "She's amazing, smart, caring, a rare kind of person. You know what I mean? When you feel like you've found someone unique." "Yes," Kevin replied, his voice slightly tense. "It's definitely rare." "She's a professor," the man continued, seemingly unaware of Kevin's unease. "She has such a special energy. You know, that person who makes you feel at ease, like you can be yourself all the time. She must be a very special person," Kevin said, feeling his stomach churn. He tried not to show his distress, but every detail the man shared seemed to point to one conclusion. "She is," the man said, smiling as he looked out the window. "It's funny how things happen. I was going through a tough time, and then she showed up. It's like she came into my life at just the right moment." "It's interesting how things like that happen," Kevin said, making an effort to sound neutral. "Sometimes life surprises us." The passenger agreed enthusiastically, continuing to talk about the woman who seemed to have transformed his life. Kevin listened in silence, feeling an increasing pain in his chest. The man's words were a mix of admiration and intimacy that Kevin could not ignore. "We've been together for a few months," the man said casually. "She has a place near the university. It's cozy, perfect for the nights we spend together." Kevin felt his hands sweat on the steering wheel, but kept a calm exterior. "Sounds like you found someone really special," he said, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. "Yeah," the man replied with a wide smile. "She's more than special. I don't think I've ever met anyone like her before." The rest of the trip continued in silence as Kevin tried to process everything he had heard. He still had a small hope that it was all a big misunderstanding, but the pieces were starting to fall together in a cruel way. When they reached the destination, Kevin parked the car and turned slightly toward the passenger. "Here we are, 45 Wolf Street," he said, keeping his tone neutral. "Thanks," the man said, handing over the money and getting out of the car. Kevin remained seated in the taxi, motionless, watching as the man walked toward the door. His heart was pounding like an out-of-control drum in his chest. Every step the stranger took seemed to echo in his mind like a harbinger of something terrible. Then the door opened and Betty appeared. She was so focused on greeting the man that she didn't notice Kevin's taxi parked in front of the house. Her smile was radiant, welcoming, the same smile Kevin knew so well, but at that moment it seemed directed at someone else. He saw her stretch her arms to embrace the man, hugging him with intimacy. They exchanged a few words that Kevin couldn't hear, and then they both entered the house, closing the door. For a moment, Kevin remained paralyzed. He felt a deep and crushing pain, but alongside that, a cold determination began to form. "I need to see it with my own eyes," he whispered to himself as he turned off the taxi's engine and got out of the car. He looked around to make sure no one was watching before crossing the street toward the house. His heart felt like a heavy stone, each step more difficult than the last. As he approached the house, Kevin carefully circled the perimeter, looking for a vantage point. The living room window was open, and he crouched beside it, peeking through the curtains. There they were, Betty and the man. She was sitting beside him on the sofa, one hand resting on his arm as they talked. There was something so intimate and relaxed about the scene that Kevin could hardly believe what he was seeing. Then, as if destiny wanted to end any remaining doubts, the man leaned in and kissed Betty. It was a long, passionate kiss that made Kevin close his eyes for a moment, fighting the urge to confront them right there. When he opened his eyes again, he saw Betty getting up and taking the man's hand, guiding him toward the hallway that led to the bedroom. Kevin knew he had to act, but he also knew he needed proof. He circled the house once more, reaching the back door. Betty had a habit of leaving it unlocked, a careless trait that now seemed providential. Kevin slowly turned the handle and entered, making sure to close the door behind him without making a sound. The house was silent, except for the distant sound of laughter coming from the bedroom. Kevin could hear his blood pounding in his ears as he walked down the hallway, trying to keep his steps light. When he reached the bedroom door, he saw that it was ajar. He peeked through the gap and felt his stomach churn. Betty and the man were lying on the bed, exchanging kisses and caresses. Kevin took out his phone with trembling hands and started taking pictures, each click a blow to his heart. He knew these images would be necessary, but the act of capturing them felt unbearably cruel. After taking the pictures, Kevin put his phone away and took a deep breath. He opened the door forcefully, making it slam against the wall. Betty and the man quickly pulled away, both with expressions of shock and panic. "What's going on here?" Kevin said, his voice firm but filled with pain. He felt his chest about to explode, the words coming out like sharp blades. "Kevin!" Betty screamed, pulling the sheet to cover her body, while her face transformed into pure desperation. I can explain!" The man, still sitting on the bed, looked at Kevin with confusion. "Wait a second. You're the taxi driver? What are you doing here?" Kevin pointed a finger at him, anger boiling like a volcano about to erupt. "Yes, it's me. Now tell me, do you think it was a coincidence that I was there? I asked about your destination because I recognized the address. And you know what I found out? That you were heading to my wife's house." The man's eyes widened, shock overtaking his face. He slowly stood up, raising his hands as if trying to defend himself. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know she was married." He turned to Betty, incredulity giving way to anger. "You told me you were single. How could you lie to me like that?" "Patrick, please let me explain," Betty cried desperately, reaching out for him, but Patrick pushed her away with a harsh gesture. "Explain what?" Kevin shouted, his eyes fixed on Betty. "You destroyed everything, Betty. Everything we built together, and you had the nerve to bring another man into this house?" "Kevin, please," Betty pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "It was a mistake. I made a horrible mistake, but I still love you. This doesn't mean anything." "Doesn't mean anything?" Kevin let out a bitter laugh, pain overflowing in his voice. "Nothing? You're here, lying in bed with another man, and you want me to believe that this means nothing? How can you be so cynical, Betty?" "I didn't want to hurt anyone," Betty sobbed. "I was confused. I don't know what happened. I just want you to understand. Understand." Kevin stepped forward, his voice rising. "You want me to understand. How do you think I feel? How do you think it feels to hear a man talk so enthusiastically about the amazing woman he found, only to find out that woman is my wife? You've played with our life, Betty, played with our marriage." Betty fell to her knees, gripping the sheet tightly as tears continued to pour down her face. "Please, Kevin, forgive me. I know I was wrong, but I love you. I still love you. I don't want to lose you." Patrick crossed his arms, his eyes filled with rage and frustration. "This is unbelievable," he said, looking at Betty with disdain. "Not only did you cheat on your husband, but you used me too. And me, what am I to you? A fling, a pastime?" "Patrick, it's not like that." Betty tried to justify herself, but her voice was broken by sobs. "I was feeling lonely. Kevin and I were distant. I didn't know what to do." So the solution was to cheat," Kevin yelled, cutting her off. "The solution was to bring another man into your bed while I was out there working, fighting to keep things going." "I know I was wrong," Betty said, begging. "I know I did everything wrong, but that doesn't mean I don't love you. Please, Kevin, give me a chance." Patrick stepped forward, pointing at Kevin. "Look, man, I'm really sorry. I had no idea she was married. You need to know that. I wouldn't have gotten involved if I knew." Kevin nodded slowly, taking a deep breath to try to control his anger. "I believe you," he said with a more controlled tone. "You're not to blame for getting involved with a woman who lied to you. The blame is all on her." Betty slowly got up, her pleading eyes fixed on Kevin. "Please, Kevin, don't leave like this. Let's talk. Let's fix this. I can change. I can make it right." "Make it right?" Kevin laughed bitterly. "There's no making it right, Betty. You destroyed everything. The trust, the respect, everything. There's no turning back." He turned on his heel, ignoring Betty's desperate protests. Patrick remained motionless, looking at her with a mix of anger and disappointment. "You didn't just deceive me," he said before leaving through the door. "You also made me feel part of something that should have never existed." Kevin walked to the door, grabbed the keys to the taxi, and left the house. He felt the crushing weight of betrayal, but also a sense of relief for finally seeing the truth. He got in the car, started the engine, and drove down the street, leaving behind not just Betty and Patrick, but also the fragments of a marriage he knew could never be rebuilt. In the days following the incident, Kevin's life became a whirlwind of emotions. The pain of betrayal hung over him like a heavy cloud, turning every moment into a battle to move forward. He could hardly sleep. The images of Betty and Patrick together replayed in his mind like an endless nightmare. The nights were long and lonely, and the days, though filled with work, seemed to drag on in an endless cycle of sadness and anger. Kevin continued to drive his taxi, but the enthusiasm he once found in his routine had disappeared. He avoided talking too much with passengers, fearing that the slightest interaction might open up emotions he couldn't control. One afternoon, while at home, the sound of the doorbell brought him back from his dark thoughts. He walked to the door with heavy steps, not really eager to receive whoever it was. When he opened it, his heart skipped a beat to see Betty standing there, her eyes red and swollen. She was holding a small purse and seemed hesitant, almost regretful to be there. "Kevin," she said, her voice low, "please, I need to talk to you." He took a deep breath, evaluating her for a moment before opening the door wider. "Come in," he said, his voice cold and controlled. He walked to the living room and sat in the armchair, gesturing for her to take a seat on the couch. "Say what you need to say." Betty sat down, adjusting the purse in her lap. For a moment, she remained silent, as if gathering courage. "I know I was the worst person possible," she finally said, her voice trembling. "I ruined everything, and there's nothing I can say that will justify what I did, but I need you to know that I deeply regret it." "Regret?" Kevin said, leaning forward, his eyes fixed on her. "What exactly? Being caught? Or destroying our marriage?" "Everything," Betty replied, with tears beginning to fall from her face. "I was lost, Kevin. I felt so alone, confused, and I made the biggest mistake of my life." "Don't come to me with those empty excuses," Kevin said, his voice hardening. "You made your choices, Betty. Now deal with the consequences." Betty lowered her head, unable to meet his gaze. "Patrick left me," she whispered. "After what happened, he said he couldn't trust me anymore. He said I wasn't the person he thought I was." "Then go after him," Kevin replied, crossing his arms, "or find someone else. I'm not your concern anymore, Betty." "Please," she begged, lifting her face to look at him. "I don't want anyone else. I want you, Kevin. I want to fix this. I want a chance to make things right." Kevin slowly shook his head, a bitter smile on his lips. "Do you think it's that simple? That you can come here, say a few words, and everything will be fixed? No, Betty. I'm filing for divorce, and I hope that makes it clear that there's nothing between us anymore." Betty started to cry uncontrollably, but Kevin remained unmoved. He stood up, walked to the door, and opened it. "Go away," he said, without looking back. "I have nothing more to say." "Kevin, please," Betty said, but he didn't wait to hear the rest. He closed the door, blocking both her screams and her presence. For a moment he stood there, pressing his forehead against the wood, feeling the weight of what he had just done. But deep down, he knew it was the only right thing to do. The following days were filled with the bureaucracy of the divorce. Kevin gathered the evidence he had collected, handing it to the lawyer with a coldness that masked his pain. Betty tried to contest, but the evidence was overwhelming. The court ruled that she would have no claim to any of the assets accumulated during the marriage, leaving her with little more than what she could carry. News of the betrayal began to spread, especially at the university where Betty taught. Initially, it was just whispers among students, but soon the gossip turned into jokes. During classes, giggles echoed through the room, and students made indirect comments clearly referring to the situation. Betty's authority was being eroded day by day until it became impossible to maintain control. She was called to the administration office and, with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration, received the news that she would be dismissed. The official justification mentioned a loss of trust from both the students and the administration. Meanwhile, Kevin began to rebuild his life. He threw himself into work, finding some comfort in the routine that had always been a constant in his life. Slowly, he began to feel lighter, more able to face the future. There were still scars, but he learned to turn them into strength. He bought a new car, renovated the house, and, over time, allowed himself to imagine a future that didn't include Betty. Betty, on the other hand, faced a constant decline. Without a job and without the stability Kevin had provided, she moved to a small apartment in a less privileged area. The friends who had once surrounded her began to distance themselves, and she found herself increasingly isolated. The regret she carried was a weight that seemed to grow with each passing day, but she knew it was too late to fix her mistakes. Kevin, now with a new perspective on life, maintained his dignity intact. He knew the pain of betrayal would never fully disappear, but he also knew he had done his best to move forward with integrity. And while Betty dealt with the consequences of her choices, Kevin walked toward a future that, though uncertain, was marked by freedom and the strength of someone who chose not to surrender to the pain. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.